Welcome to the Project Schola Podcast, brought to you by the Philos-Sophia initiative, breaking through the barrier of scientific belief. I'm your host, John Trevor Berger, and I'm joined today by a friend of ours in London, John Taylor. We're here to talk about the work of Professor Wolfgang Smith and his foundation, the Philos-Sophia initiative. The Philos-Sophia initiative aims to facilitate a transformative impact upon our civilization through the recovery of the vertical aspect of cosmic reality based upon the philosophical and scientific discoveries of Wolfgang Smith. The initiative proposes a dynamic outreach to minds profoundly committed to truth, inviting them to an encounter with a comprehensive worldview that integrates the fundamental discoveries of physics into the perennial wisdom of mankind. Dr. Smith's latest book, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology, is now available at Philos-Sophia.org. That's Philos-Sophia.org. And you'll find the link directly below on the product page, directly below to the product page in the show notes. The book is available in paperback for $19.95 and hardcover for $35.95. It's also available in ebook format on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iBooks, and you can reach those through the aforementioned product page where we have buttons that go, directly to the Kindle site and so forth. Also, if you haven't already, we invite you to watch our documentary film on the life and work of Dr. Smith, The End of Quantum Reality. Visit theendofquantumreality.com, where you can rent or buy on digital streaming. You can also buy on DVD or Blu-ray. Again, that's theendofquantumreality.com. You might also be interested in the film soundtrack, incidentally, composed and performed by Richard Delano, and you can listen to that pretty much wherever you like to get your music from, though there is a hard disk available as well from the website. Finally, we offer annual membership subscriptions to the initiative for $45. And that gives you a complimentary rental of The End of Quantum Reality, a link to Rick Delano's hit theme song to the film, One Way Up, advance access to things like this podcast, feature articles, some occasional member exclusives, and more as time goes by. And once again, you'll find a link below in the notes included with this episode. And also remember, if you like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, which again, you'll find in a link below. Now, what are we going to talk about today? As a little prelude to what we'll be discussing in this episode, perhaps the most important vital point one has to recognize coming to understand what Wolfgang Smith is talking about is his distinction between the physical and the corporeal. The physical universe versus the corporeal world, physical objects versus corporeal objects. Wolfgang grants the physicist the term physical. That's where we've gotten to. But in order to clarify things, he says that the world of sensory perception, what he means by that is not physical. In other words, to say in Wolfgang's nomenclature, it would be incorrect to say that what I perceive with my eyes or hear or touch are physical objects. They're not. They're corporeal objects. And this is because the physical is the domain of purely the quantitative objects. And quantitative objects are, in fact, imperceptible by definition, if you will. What we perceive, rather, is in Wolfgang's nomenclature, as I said, the corporeal world. And the signature of the corporeal is that it possesses real qualities, not something merely in our head, not something that we project onto the object, such as colors and textures and sounds they make, or tastes they have. This means that the manifestation of perceptible qualities, that in this manifestation, we are able to identify the essences of things. We are presented a thing's nature, its form, its identity through the manifestations, through the qualitative attributes, through the qualitative manifestations of things. And again, let's be clear, we do not perceive the physical universe. We do conceive of it, or at least the physical universe is the universe as conceived by the physicist. What we do perceive, again, is the corporeal world, and again, the two are not one and the same. Not only that, but the physical objects are, so to speak, parasitic upon corporeal objects. Consequently, the physical universe is generally parasitic upon the corporeal world, if you will. Another way of putting this is to say that physics has to begin by observations and measurements, that is, of perceptible objects to begin with. And then, in order to proceed, these observed and measured phenomena are pushed or abstracted to their ideal limits, to the point where we're eventually just dealing with quantitative parameters, ideal limits, essentially a number or a variable that can be fit into an equation. Obviously, a quality cannot be fit into an equation. Obviously, an identity, a substance cannot be fit into an equation, but a number can. Therefore, the corporeal world from which we begin is basically, by the methodological procedures of physics, what happens is that the corporeal world and its qualitative attributes, which are the starting point prior to the physicist's intervention, are sort of exercised or simply pushed to the side. And this is fine as a methodological procedure. But a huge problem has resulted insofar as, instead of merely taking this as a methodological principle or procedure, that this is many will say these days that, well, this is simply how things are. In other words, you could say that the physicist has basically has observed the territory, he's constructed a map of the territory, and in the popular imagination, and I would say even in the scientists, these two, the map and the territory, have become conflated. And in fact, apparently, some are now saying that what's really real isn't the territory, but the map. So in other words, I've got the map now. This is more real than the landscape. The blueprint is more real than the skyscraper. So this isn't good, obviously, at least if you have common sense. And one of the things that Dr. Wolfgang Smith has made his business is to correct such errors. And these relate directly to the nature of perception, obviously, in particular, visual perception. And he has advanced arguments and brought to our attention other thinkers who have advanced arguments that really enable us to rediscover the corporeal world again. That world which, if we hadn't been brought up learning scientific fallacies and continually being conditioned by the so-called science press, we would have always taken for granted as the real world, not just atoms and empty space, if you will. And so The main topic that John and I will be discussing today is visual perception. But first, let's learn a little bit about our guest, shall we? John Taylor, welcome. How's London these days?
Thank you for having me on. London's good. Thank you.
And you go to school in the city of London, don't you?
Yes, I'm currently attending University College London, studying philosophy. I'm in my third and final year. So
yeah, I found that interesting when we talked the other day, that you guys actually have 3-year bachelors rather than our typical. Everything's 4 years here, 4 years high school, 4 years college.
yeah.
But where are you originally from?
So I'm from a town called Godalming, which is in a county. It's called Surrey. So I live outside of London. I live in the countryside. But not too far, not too distant away from London.
Right. Yeah. I know of Surrey. I haven't really seen any pictures of it, but I have read descriptions of it in a book by C.S. Lewis, who was tutored there as an adolescent. And he apparently, if it's anything like it was 100 years ago, it's apparently just one of the most beautiful places one could conceive.
Yeah,
would you agree?
Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but yeah, definitely some beautiful scenes there for sure.
Yeah,
and some non-other
good. He said that whoever designed the towns and whatnot, it's like if there was, it's as if they were trying to evoke the idea of happiness. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
So
I see where it's coming from.
Yeah. So you actually come from a family that boasts quite a few scientists. Is that right?
Yeah, my dad has a degree in physics. A couple of my uncles have PhDs in physics, and my great uncle was the deputy director of, I believe, the LHC at CERN. I mean, he's quite involved in applied physics in CERN.
Wow.
So
Wow.
yeah, I have a few, but not too many philosophers.
Not too many philosophers.
Except for myself.
Yeah. Did your father do anything professionally with physics or anything?
He didn't do it professionally. But I mean, he's got a master's in, I think, something relating to computer science or something to that effect. So he's been involved in computer science, and
I see. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. Right.
And so you mentioned you're in your final year, so that's where you are in your academic career at the moment. Now, you have plans for graduate school or?
Yes, so I've applied for my master's, and hopefully I'll be attending LSE, London School of Economics, or UCL. So that's the choice I face, and we'll see how that goes.
Well, that's a fine institution from what I understand, London School of Economics. And I think you mentioned when we talked before that there's a department there that was actually founded by Karl Popper.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, the philosophy, logic and scientific method department was founded by Karl Popper, who was obviously a very famous philosopher of science, and yes, contributed a lot of interesting ideas.
And we're a fan of Popper here because Popper advanced the idea of the need for falsification, but a lot of scientists these days want to say that, well, the theory is just so beautiful, it can't not be true. It's like to forget about falsification, forget about the scientific method. Let's follow the math and see where that takes us, even if it takes us to the multiverse, which we can't prove, or which we can't falsify. And that's rather convenient. It's a rather convenient situation to be in, that if there's no falsification criterion, then you really can't be wrong, I guess. Now, how did you come upon the work of Wolfgang Smith?
Yeah, so it was a few years ago, back in 2020, I think. And I think it was I watched one of the podcasts that I think Rick Delano was on, and he started talking about Wolfgang Smith's work, how it related to quantum physics. And then I read the Quantum Enigma after that, and I read Science and Myth, and then Ancient Wisdoms, and yeah, his a whole series of his books. Became very interested, and then came across the Philos-Sophia initiative during that time, and so yeah, I'd say my introduction started because of one of the podcasts that Rick Delano
right
was.
And I seem to remember that you were we first encountered you, I think, through Vimeo, a comment you made on Vimeo, on the end of quantum reality on Vimeo. And you were asking some questions about the Heisenberg cut and whatnot, and Rick, who narrated and produced and wrote the film, had, you know, I was like, what do I say, you know, to this guy, you know, because I had understood the distinction between the physical and the corporeal, but I had never heard the term Heisenberg cut before. Those who have listened to this podcast know that I come very much from a philosophical humanities background, as opposed to a science background. So there's a lot I've learned what I could. I've learned what I can, but some of the technical nomenclature, you know, popular science things I'm not up to and completely. But that sparked an interesting course of events. The Heisenberg cut, and then you I think that you brought to our attention some of the research that George Ellis and Barbara Drossel have done on the heat bath when they were trying to investigate the quantum measurement problem, and you were participated with Wolfgang in an article that well, you wrote a couple articles. You wrote an article about that subject. You wrote a couple articles on the website, and then one of those articles became a chapter in the book, in the new book, Physics and Vertical Causation. No, what am I saying? In the new book, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology. Physics and Vertical Causation was an earlier book, which Philos-Sophia is going to republish all of these books, by the way. We're working on it. We've got Cosmos and for our audience, you know, we got Cosmos and Transcendence so far republished, but then we're trying to get back to it. We've been publishing Wolfgang's new books, as he keeps saying this is going to be his last book, and then he writes a new one. So we've been publishing those, working on those. And in any case, so back to wrapping up the question here, what do you think Wolfgang's work will figure into your graduate studies, and do you have any ideas? If so, any ideas on how his work might figure in? Have you given that any thought? Or
Yeah, I've definitely given that a lot of thought, and because the masters I want to take will be in the philosophy of science, there'll definitely be some relation. So I think, you know, one of the topics I thought about is James Gibson, and there's definitely some unsolved problems which we want to talk about today. So James Gibson is an option. I think maybe there are some other more finer interpretations of Wolfgang's work on quantum mechanics that could be implemented in some sort of graduate thesis. But yeah, I think I definitely want to extend his work and hopefully link that in as I progress through my career.
That's fantastic. The something we both have in common is we both studied philosophy in contemporary academia. For my part, much like Wolfgang. I personally was very satisfied with it. I mean, I wanted so badly to be a professor, but I just didn't have the patience for the bureaucracy and the red tape, and not to mention the what we could kindly say is the a sort of a reduced conception of what philosophy is, and a lot of, not all of, but a good many of the Anglo-American universities nowadays. Now, evidently, you do have the patience for it, and you seem to try to focus on the positives from what I've gleaned in the past things you said. I mean, is there anything else you would be interested in saying about your experience as a philosophy undergraduate?
I mean, yeah, I've definitely encountered some negatives. But I think, if there's one thing that I've found very interesting in studying philosophy, is that even the most atheistic philosophers that you could imagine, like Bertrand Russell or Quine, they do make concessions to our worldview. Quine believes in Platonic entities, mathematical entities. Russell also believed that. Wittgenstein believed that. So I think if there's one thing I've learned, is that this attempt to reduce everything to the physical, that didn't even appeal to the most materialistic philosophers there are. So it definitely says something to our worldview, and yeah, that would be something very interesting that I've taken away from my studying philosophy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not even the most committed physicalists are wholly committed to reducing everything to the physical.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because Quine, he had his indispensability argument, which are you aware of that argument?
No, no, I wouldn't be. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I'm not personally. No.
But I mean, Quine's whole philosophy was that, science comes first and philosophy second. But I think he discovered, after sort of examining this, that you couldn't dispense with mathematical entities, because mathematical entities are so key to science, and you have to have ontological commitment to them. So that was his indispensability argument, and yeah, I think it says a lot.
Yeah, that does make sense. Well, and it's interesting because science comes first, philosophy second. I mean, in a sense, that's an old venerable principle in a way. I mean, Aristotle begins in the physics and goes to the metaphysics. Well, that's the conventional view. There are other interpretations that
I think
suggest.
he didn't believe in a priori knowledge would be
Well, yeah,
maybe
well,
more, yeah.
that could be a way of putting it. Yeah. But my point is that in sort of one of the movements I sort of come out of, truth is achieved in the sciences, not only the sciences, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's say, truth is achieved in the sciences, and then philosophy enters in a radical reflection upon the truth acquired, as opposed to trying to, when you try to replace the sciences with philosophy, you end up as basically a Cartesian rationalist. Everything requires some kind of rigorous metaphysical proof, as opposed to, and it sort of takes intellective reflexivity out of the equation, which is completely beyond the point. And this all kind of leads up to what we're going to be talking about today. John already mentioned James Gibson. Wolfgang gave a very nice synopsis of Gibson, of Gibson's basic what Gibson, how he started and what he did in the new book, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology. I'm going to quote that real quick, this paragraph, and then we can go from there. Excuse me. So in the 1940s, Gibson received a government grant. He had recently got his PhD from Princeton, and he received a government grant to devise tests for the selection of military pilots. This early 1940s, World War II. And what stood at issue is the ability to determine what's called the aiming point in a state of complex motion, a faculty needed by pilots, for instance, landing their plane on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Gibson discovered that the information given in the retinal image, it just doesn't suffice for the achievement of making that landing. And the retinal image theory is the predominant theory. Basically, in a nutshell, we could say that the eye is basically functions the same way as a camera. So clarifying for the audience here. And this is the visual image theory, the retinal image theory. Excuse me. Now, Gibson found out that there is insufficient information on the retina to be able to land a plane, basically. Now, if this indeed be the case, Wolfgang says, the argument can be made that this fact alone disqualifies this prevailing retinal image theory of perception. And that is the conclusion that the young Gibson did arrive at. And what followed were decades of empirical investigation into just how we do perceive the external world, out of which emerged what Gibson terms the ecological theory of visual perception. To emphasize, he calls it the ecological theory because he's emphasizing the fact that what we perceive is not, an image, be it retinal, cortical, or any other kind, but the external environment. So ecological pertains to the environment. And this is basically more or less identical to what Wolfgang calls the corporeal world. So that's what the environment is in the ecological theory of visual perception. And what Gibson argued on strictly empirical grounds is that what we perceive visually is not inside the head, but pertains indeed to the external world, the very realm, incidentally, with which the natural sciences are concerned. And Wolfgang makes a really clever point here where he says that what I find perhaps most amazing of all is that Gibson was highly regarded within the academic community throughout his career, notwithstanding the fact that his discovery proves lethal to the prevailing and supposedly scientific worldview, a fact which might not have been generally recognized. And of course, Wolfgang's quip there is that had his colleagues actually realized the import of his own discovery, of Gibson's discovery, they would have realized that the scientific outlook that Gibson had sort of undercut the entire Cartesian bifurcationist paradigm upon which so much of physics and the methodological principles of physics, and then the scientific reduction of trying to extrapolate that vision to saying that this is the ultimate shape of reality, or the principles of reality. The principles of physics are the principles of reality as a whole. And Gibson implicitly proved that wrong. But even though he was revered by his colleagues, Apparently they didn't catch it. It just like went over their head. So the visual image theory is a snow job, is basically what we're saying here. And that what we do really perceive is not something in the head, as I believe John Locke said, what we perceive are our own ideas. And Gibson says, no, we perceive the world, we perceive the environment. And now there are a lot of specifics and terminologies, a lot of technical terms and nomenclature in Gibson's thought. And I don't even know if we have the time to go through them all, such, invariance and in affordances and ground and substance and all. There's I actually had a list here of all of these technical terms. The most important are invariants, the pickup, well, we could say affordances perhaps, and invariants picked up from ambient light as opposed to radiant light, or what Gibson termed the ambient optic array. So, John, what do you have to say about Gibson and about these what you know of the ecological theory? What thoughts do you have? What reflections have you had on it in your research?
I think Gibson's work, I think it vindicates direct realism, which in turn vindicates Wolfgang Smith's ontology. I think if you're open to direct realism, if you prove that, then you can't sort of quarantine these metaphysical entities. You've got to open yourself up to a much broader ontology, which is found in Wolfgang Smith's work. So I think what Gibson has done in general is very important, very valuable. With regard to specific things, I think there could be some implications with physics in Gibson's work that, sort of haven't been investigated. So we could talk about that if you want.
What thoughts do you have on that? Even just, preliminary suspicions, I guess you could say, about the connection of the ecological theory or simply visual perception with physics. I mean, obviously there is a physics of eyesight, I guess, optics. I mean, so it's not like it's unprecedented, but I think you have some ideas about that. You not?
Yeah, so
preliminary
Gibson,
at least.
Yeah, I mean, Gibson, he talks about invariants which carry qualities. And one of the principles in physics that connects to is something called Landauer's principle, which basically postulates that if you erase information, there should be an increase in entropy. So because we have this sort of whole array of ecological information out there, there should be some effects in which the erasure of that information leads to some increase in thermodynamic entropy. So there should be a connection between Gibson's discovery of this ecological information and thermodynamics. This is something that I've talked about with Wolfgang. Wolfgang has considered these sorts of points. And yeah, but it's something that I think the scientists need to investigate, because we're getting into that place where you need experimental data to sort of verify there is a connection between thermodynamics and Gibson's work.
Right. How you mentioned direct realism. How would you say we ought to define realism? I mean, really, this is for the benefit of the audience,
Right.
there, I've seen many different definitions of it, and I think that it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, to me, there's just one meaning to it. Personally, I mean, I take realism to be the doctrine. It's not even a doctrine, really. To me, it's a self-evident axiom that what we perceive through the senses is an objectively existing world. Not only that, not just the corporeal world, but also we've talked about before, and this has played a large part in Wolfgang's more recent research, is his tripartition of the world into the corporeal, the intermediary, and the aveternal. Now, in the case of the microcosm, man himself, there is the body, the soul, or the psyche, and then the spirit or intellect. And what I find really interesting about this, and my point is that these are real, and in fact, you're actually ascending in reality. And for those who aren't familiar with these definitions, the corporeal world is characterized by its spatiotemporality, you could say. It's bound by space and time. The intermediary, the reason it's intermediary is because it's intermediate between the aveternal and the corporeal. The intermediary is bound by time alone. And in the case of human beings, this is the domain in which we think, we reason, and we think through things and imagine through things. And then the aveternal is beyond even time. So it's supra spatiotemporal, beyond space and time. And this is the domain for us, for the human person. The aveternal principle within us is the intellect, and the intellect we perceive is really the means by which we perceive, even in the senses. I mean, really, it's because there's a distinction between sensation and perception. And one of the points I wanted to make was that, Wolfgang's most detailed treatment of Gibson is in a chapter entitled "The Enigma of Visual Perception," which eventually was published in one of his books. But first, it was published in Sophia, the Journal of Traditional Studies, in the summer of 2004. Now, I find this fascinating because even back then, he was already intimating or chipping away towards the cosmological vision that he's really been fleshing out in earnest in the last 5 years. And the reason I point this out is because there are observations that Wolfgang makes about Gibson and Gibson's work, and conclusions that Gibson came to, that only make sense in light of a metaphysical realist understanding of, or classical understanding of, intellection. And so the tripartition is all, there are comments that he makes, it's really kind of already implicit even back then. Wolfgang points out in this Gibson piece that the greater depth a science attains, the more it stands in need of metaphysical interpretation. And there are certain things that Gibson said that from a purely psychosomatic point of view really don't make sense. Like, for instance, Gibson said that the world is not viewed in perspective. He said that one can perceive an object or a whole habitat at no fixed point of observation. He also said that they can be perceived without the intervention of memory. Now, Wolfgang's contention is that the only way to make sense of these findings is from a metaphysical point of view, from the understanding of the intellect, because if you have, but by the intellective faculty, the direct seeing of truth, and visual perception is connected directly to that. It's a long discussion in making that connection, but as Wolfgang says here, what makes such recognitions as Gibson makes incomprehensible not only to the layman but to the scientist is the fact that they are expressive of a metaphysical truth. The fact, namely, that perception takes place in the intellect, which is limited neither by space nor time. It appears that in tenets such as these, Gibson has isolated what may be termed intellective features of perception, traits that constitute effects of intellective agency, which defies psychosomatic interpretation. Moreover, a psychosomatic act, by virtue of its somatic nature, is unable in principle to transcend the organism of the human body. And if it indeed be the case that the terminus of visual perception is ecological, pertains to the environment, as Gibson maintains, this in itself implies that the perceptual act is not, in fact, psychosomatic. If perception were psychosomatic, the percept could be no more external to the organism than a sensation of hunger or pain, an internal sensation, and no amount of brain processing can alter this fact. And so Wolfgang goes on to say, which is rather brilliant observation, that one sees that Gibson was justified in observing total silence on the question of how one does register invariants. And invariants, incidentally, within the ambient optic array are essentially forms, what we would call forms. So how one does register.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
But what kind of forms would we be saying?
I think we would be saying substantial. Well, it's interesting because substantial forms, but once again, the formal principle is perceived as opposed to sensed, I think. We sense qualities, and but we don't perceive a thing as a whole from every angle. We can't perceive. We can only perceive things or sense things in part, but we can perceive the whole of a thing even though it's not present. Half of the room is half of the room could be absent to me, but I still perceive a room as a whole. Or half of a cube could be bent in such a way that it looks like a trapezoid, and I can't look at all sides of a cube at once, but I still perceive the cubeness, the cubity, the identity of the cube through this array of manifestations, and these and I suspect that, and so that's what I that's the form, the identity, and in Gibson this would be the invariant. Now, to finish off this real quick, this thing that Wolfgang says here, because there's a point I wanted to make about it. That's why I'm reading this. For indeed, there exists no psychosomatic means for the accomplishment of the feat of registering invariants, perceiving forms, whereas the intellective means are excluded from scientific discourse. We're not allowed to, appeal to direct perception, according to by the scientific standard, and what to many of his colleagues, Gibson's colleagues, appeared as a radical deficiency and a mark of incompleteness in the theory, proved thus to be its greatest merit. For that seeming deficiency expresses what constitutes the very essence of the perceptual act. Now, what I want to say about this is that, we're not saying, nor is Wolfgang saying, that Gibson per se recognized the metaphysical implications of his own theory. Allegedly he didn't. That's my understanding, is that he didn't. But the point is that he provided a rigorous empirical falsification for the whole Cartesian paradigm, the visual image paradigm, which is founded on bifurcationism, which we talked a lot about in the pilot episode with me and Brian Murphy. And being that modern science really presupposes bifurcationist principles, Gibson's Discovery calls for a whole rehashing of the empiriological sciences. I mean, we need a new paradigm. And this is one of the great things about the work of Wolfgang Smith, of course, is because to a great extent, Wolfgang actually has, to a great extent, rehashed the sciences in light of some of the findings of certain scientists who have sort of bumped up against a limit. Like he among included Gibson, he also cites like Werner Heisenberg and John Stuart Bell and Kurt Gödel. Well, anyways, so we could talk all day about Gibson. Maybe someday we'll do a webinar on it or something. There's a lot of technicalities, and it's but the bottom line is, as we said, Gibson established on empirical grounds that your common sense is right. What you perceive, things appear as they are, and they are as they appear. We're not cut off from the world. We're not stuck in our own head. That's the bottom line. And there are other higher metaphysical truths about this that, Wolfgang has observed as well, about, Gibson really makes more sense in light of a classical Platonist understanding of intellect as transcendent, a eternal principle, which perceives forms. And Wolfgang relates this to the what Gibson calls invariants. And so anyways, we've been talking a lot about J.J. Gibson here so far. And again, Wolfgang, he really does sing. You'll find in his writings, he really singles out Gibson as a champion of the reestablishment of metaphysical realism, and on empirical grounds, no less. But last we talked, you mentioned some other contemporary research that's been done that is headed toward sort of the same destination, though I suspect by very different means, or somewhat different means at least. I know you mentioned, I think, color constancy. You mentioned amodal perception. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of those things that you've come across? Go.
So color constancy, this is basically the phenomenon where we perceive an object as having the same color despite changes in light or changes in illumination. So to give a good example, if you take a white object, this reflects white light. It also reflects all the light that is contained within white light, so blue light, red light, etc. So obviously under white light conditions, such as in natural daylight or under a light bulb, you'll perceive that object as white. But under conditions where, let's say you have a light source which is emitting one species of light, so just blue, you will still perceive that object as white. However, you should perceive it as blue because technically speaking, blue rays are just are being received by your eyes. So we have this very interesting phenomenon where an individual maybe is not actually receiving the rays corresponding to the color of the object that they're seeing. So this does call for some sort of non-physical explanation as to how this is able to occur. And I think another very interesting aspect of this is that it occurs with objects that we've never perceived before. So it can't be some mental inference that we make to the effect that, you know, I'm receiving blue rays, but I infer that it's white based on past experiences. That's not going on. So we do sort of directly perceive, without the light, so to speak, that an object has a particular color, which is very interesting and relates to Wolfgang's work, Wolfgang's ontology.
Indeed. Yeah. So if I understand this correctly, what this is basically telling us is that you cannot reduce color to frequency or wavelength, because the white cabinet, the white surface or whatever that I'm looking at in blue light, I don't see it as blue. I see it as white.
Mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
but
I
you
mean,
should see it as blue. You should see it as blue because if you take the model,
if the
Yeah.
physical explanation of things is correct, then we should see it as blue.
Yeah. And if you were to see a white cabinet that you've never seen before in blue light, you'll see it as white straight away. There's no inference that's taking place. So it's a very, very unusual phenomenon.
So it's kind of like
Yeah.
it's kind of like what Gibson says, is that's kind of like, isn't it, what Gibson says about no processing is involved.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we mentioned that much really before, but Gibson says talks about how when we are engaged in direct perception, we're not just there isn't, it's not like a computer processing information. In fact, he says that there's like the eye, brain, body system. You know, I mean, the eye, the brain, and body are one perceptual system, and they work like together as an organism. Does that sound right to you? I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so what else? We also mentioned amodal perception. Isn't that another thing?
Yeah, I think that's basically the fact that we perceive wholes when only parts are present. And I'm not sure. I mean, there are some interesting experiments on that. I'm not sure what there are, what the experiments are, but I know that there's a whole literature on amodal perception. So that could be something that's worth exploring in the future. But I don't have a whole lot to add on that. It's basically that if you have an object that is occluded, like, I don't know, like you only see like half of a pen because it's blocked by something or whatever, you sort of perceive the whole pen, so to speak.
It kind of goes back to, so this kind of goes back to something we touched upon a minute ago. Even though I only perceive something in part, or even though I only sense something in part, I still perceive its wholeness. And you know, people who have heard me before will probably grow weary of my tendency to appeal to the phenomenological tradition, in particular the thought of Edmund Husserl. But you know, when you mentioned amodal perception before, could not help but think that and in fact there are Husserl scholars who are very interested in Gibson's work, and they have talked about how Husserl, just through phenomenological analysis, came to a lot of the conclusions that Gibson came to through empirical research. So it's a fascinating sort of jump that Husserl kind of got on a lot of 20th century researchers and thinkers. And get, you know, and Husserl has been an influence on Wolfgang as well. I think more so than he realizes, but that's probably because I mean, because he has studied Husserl, but he doesn't cite him that much. He did write a piece that references Husserl in a profound way, Metaphysics as Seeing, and he references Husserl prominently in a book as providing a sort of paradigm, which is really the best way to see, understand understand the corporeal world, perhaps, which Wolfgang calls it anthropic realism, meaning essentially the same thing as we've been saying, that we aren't just given objectively things. We are also participating. In phenomenological language, we constitute things, and it's not so much that we don't constitute their being, it's their meaning that we constitute. And I won't get into constitution. I mean, that's a big theme, but what I find interesting about this idea of amodal perception is that it sounds to me, just prima facie, very reminiscent of what in phenomenology we would talk about in phenomenological analysis of identity within manifolds of appearance. So I used the example of a cube before. If we use that again, you take any object. I mean, I can only perceive one side of a cube, like completely at a time. But then I can turn it and perceive kind of a little bit of two sides, or turn it this way and see three sides. But I cannot see the cube. I cannot see the cube in its fullness. However, I do perceive the identity of the cube throughout all these different sides, all these different aspects and profiles through which the cube presents itself, manifests itself, and it slips into, and all these sides and aspects and profiles slip into absence and come into presence, and vice versa. And really there's a relationship of potency and act here going on, actual.
And I think,
Go ahead.
I think Gibson also talks about this. He talks about how we perceive things through transformations. There has to be sort of action in the environment. We don't just perceive things from a static perspective. So that definitely relates to Gibson's theory. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah. There's Gibson has this thing which I mentioned a few minutes ago, that there's a particular book I'm reading on from this one Husserl scholar who references Gibson's observation of the saccadic, I think, motion, or what is it microsaccades of eye movement, that the eye is always scanning the environment, searching the environment, and Husserl was talking about a very similar thing, which you picked up on, so we come full circle here. So anyways, What about information? I mean, what are your thoughts about this topic? Because information is a big thing in this in several contexts. Apparently, information is emerging as a very big theme in the sciences, and we don't have to get into that across the board, but certainly in visual perception, there's something about this concept of information. Now, of course, we should distinguish between the information of information theory, founded by Claude Shannon in 1948, which is called Shannon information, from what Wolfgang at least refers to as semantic information. And semantic information, I mean, the distinction between Shannon information and semantic information is kind of like the distinction between the physical and the corporeal, because when it's like, if you're typing on the keyboard, you are producing Shannon information, which is quantitative, but you are also producing semantic information, meaning you're typing sentences and words and sentences, and making grammatical information. We could say grammatical, syntactical. I don't really know how exactly you'd put it, but you should put it. But one of the things Wolfgang talks about is information as the rediscovery of forms. And now, as I see it, as well, I think that, because I'll sometimes think about like how you could accent a particular word to get a different sense from it, but like information can, as I see it, can be taken. I think the best way to put it would be a gerundial sense. Like a gerund is a verbal noun. Essentially, thinking of the term information in the same way, or using the term information in the same way that we use the word determination. So like information is like not only is it an object, but it's also an act of informing or act of forming. And so you can think of information as a formal, simply a formal principle, but it can get, some distinctions would really have to be drawn to really get to the heart of that, because information is so widespread today with the web. I mean, with the internet. I mean, everything is about information. I love these lines from T.S. Eliot. He says, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? There's, information, in other words, is almost like a fallen knowledge. But this scientific sense of information is obviously very different. I mean, do you have any thoughts about this concept of information, and also how it relates to, there's something apparently going on with information being carried in ambient light, something about that?
Yeah, I think if Gibson is correct, then it definitely, I think, yeah, we can't really use Shannon information or any other sort of quantifiable definition of information, because we're talking about qualities here. So I think Gibson's theory definitely implies some sort of non-physical information, which might be what Wolfgang calls semantic information. I think are you referring to Ancient Wisdoms and Modern Misconceptions? Is that the book?
That is in Science and Myth, I think.
Yeah.
Well, if you're referring to
I read that a while ago. The semantic. The semantic information.
Yeah, the thing about semantic, right? The point about that, right? Yeah. There was a chapter on the Dembski theorem in Ancient Wisdom and Modern Misconceptions, for older readers of Wolfgang, that would be The Wisdom of Ancient Cosmology, where he talks about, because he's talking about Wolfgang is talking about Dembski's information theoretic theorem, and that's where he makes this distinction between, says that, we don't, when we're talking about information, we don't have to just be talking about Shannon information. It's not all just quantities and whatnot. I mean, there is semantic in information, and I mean, the thing is that once you break out of the bifurcationist paradigm, you have to kind of rethink everything that you learned in that you learned in science class. I mean, because it's not that the data is necessarily wrong. It's the interpretation of data which is often wrong, and this is where scientism enters the picture. We have bad philosophical assumptions which are grounding interpretations of legitimate evidence and data. And once you correct the foundational premises and get back on solid ontological footing, now let's look at the evidence again, and what is it telling us? Because as Wolfgang likes to say, nature answers to our way of looking. I think that's a really brilliant way of putting it. There's a lot that we bring to what we find.
Yeah. Well, I think with information, with ambient light, with Gibson, what needs to be investigated is, as I said earlier, is this connection to Landauer's principle. I mean, that really does need to be investigated.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that. What I know you touched upon it earlier, but what is Landauer's principle, and again, and how does it relate to how do you suspect? I know you said it needs to be looked into. How do you suspect that it relates to perhaps the ecological theory is what you're thinking of, but visual perception?
Yeah, well, Landauer's principle is basically the discovery that if you erase information, there's essentially like an increase in entropy in the thermodynamic sense, not in the Shannon sense. So that in itself, that's quite a surprising principle, because it sort of implies that information is definitely external. It's a sort of external thing that can be erased and affect the physical. So that's a very interesting thing in and of itself. How it connects to Gibson is that obviously there's this ecological information in ambient light in the environment, and if it exists, then there should be some phenomenon where there's an increase in entropy if it's erased or affected in some way. I'm not exactly sure how this would work, and obviously this was explored by Wolfgang. We've obviously talked about this before. So I'm not sure. I've looked into the science to see if there's any research on this, and there's definitely not. So I don't know if there's any good scientists out there. They should investigate it, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully this will be something that you'll be looking into in graduate studies, because I know that Wolfgang has been he was really interested in this for a while, and he's asked some people, please look into this, because I think it's like there might be a science prize in this for somebody, if they can figure out something about this relationship, these relationships, and these this issue of ambient light and information carried in ambient light, and then Landauer's principle and whatnot.
So yeah, I think there's definitely something very interesting to investigate with.
Gotcha. Well, I wanted to, this question of information, I think we can close on, and I wanted to share some words from Wolfgang about information and its nature, and also the sort of metaphysical implications here. Viewed from a traditional point of vantage, the notion of information that has emerged in various branches of contemporary science as a basic conception can be recognized as a rediscovery of forms. This is not to say that modern science has now arrived at a pre-modern understanding of form. The point, rather, is that information in the scientific sense does ultimately refer to forms. And remember, we're talking about a pre-modern conception of forms, such as we would find in Aristotle and Plato, for example. Wolfgang also says the essence of information resides in its capacity to signify, and that is where forms enter the picture. Albert Einstein said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Indeed, if the universe were made up simply of particles and fields, as apparently Einstein imagined, it could not, in fact, be perceived, nor would it be comprehensible to the scientist or to anyone else. What renders the world perceptible to sentient beings and intelligible to man is the presence therein of forms precisely. Moreover, these forms are not subject to the bounds of space and time, and must consequently be distinguished categorically, not only from the physicist's particles and fields, but from corporeal entities as well. In a word, forms are not things, yet it is forms that constitute things and bestow upon them such reality as they possess. Deep insights. So, John, thanks again for joining us on the Project Schola Podcast. I'm sure we'll be talking again. Maybe we'll have more people on next time you're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm John Trevor Berger. This has been the Project Schola Podcast. Once again, we encourage you to check out Wolfgang's latest book, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology, now available at Philos-Sophia.org. And again, you'll find the link in the show notes to the directly to the product page itself. And again, we have the paperback and hardcover, and it's also available as an ebook. Also, you can visit theendofquantumreality.com to watch the documentary film on the life and work of Wolfgang Smith. And once again, memberships, $45 a year, which is $3.75 a month. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you like what you see. So, John Trevor Berger signing off. John Taylor signing off. We will see you again.
There must be an equation. It someday will be found to calculate the whole world up now. Once we write it down, 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 down. One way.